We have one extra. Oh yeah, we have one extra mic. So why don't we hand it to Natasha? Great. And when the mics are ready, we can get started. I'm just waiting for the mic. Sorry? Fine. You ready? Can everyone hear me okay?
Can you?
I'm seeing no's. Hello? 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 They're working over there. Give us a second. You hear it now? Oh. I hear it too. Okay. Okay, welcome everybody. This is final day of Women Deliver. I don't know if this is the last session, but we've made it to the end, and we can't leave this conference without fully addressing the Global Gag Rule, which is really the elephant in the room, I think, for so much of our work right now. I want to, before we get started, thank the partners who put together the full all of the sessions related to abortion at this conference. So IPPF, Ipas, and CRR, we're really happy and proud to be in partnership with you. And I want to say this is a very maddening topic, but it is the last day of the conference, and we're not going to end on a sad, maddening note. We're going to end on a note of power, because I think we do, in fact, all have power in this situation, even though it is designed to make us feel powerless. And I want to invite you all to join the conversation. These are some of the hashtags we're using and some of the Twitter handles you can use in joining that. So before we get started, I'm just going to introduce our panelists. Right to my left here is Giselle Carino, the President and CEO of IPPF Western Hemisphere region. Then I have Moses Malumba, the Executive Director of the Center for Health, Human Rights, and Development in Uganda. Dr. Carol Skempe, the Country Director for Maurice Stopes, Uganda. And then Taryn Fraser, who's a Women Deliver Young Leader, and very proud to say a former Planned Parenthood Global Youth Advocacy Fellow. My name is Chloe Cooney. I lead strategy and programs at Planned Parenthood Global, and really happy to be with all of you today. So let's talk about the Global Gag Rule. Most of you know this has been in place for about 2 years. It was on his first working day in office, Donald Trump, just days after the historic and global women's marches, reinstated and dramatically expanded the Global Gag Rule. I think most of you know what the policy is and does, but just to make sure, and because it always bears repeating to be sure we're clear, the policy says that as a condition of receiving U.S. global health assistance, organizations are prohibited from using any source of funds, including separate non-U.S. government funds, to do any activities related to abortion, be it information, service delivery, education, referrals, or advocating for the legalization of abortion in their own country. So what's the effect of this policy? Well, back in January, Planned Parenthood Global released a report which was at the 2-year anniversary of the reinstatement of the policy, synthesizing what we know. It built on the research from many of you in this room, interviews we did from our colleagues across IPPF, Maurice Stopes, and beyond. And we really found 3 things. The first is that it's weakening civil society. Which has wide-reaching consequences for both complying and non-complying organizations. And I think we all know in the global health space and in the human rights space how vital the civil society sector is for our long-term goals. And this policy is taking direct aim at the capacity and strength of that sector. The second finding we had is it's disrupting the delivery of a range of healthcare services. And we all know it's affecting reproductive healthcare service delivery, but it certainly doesn't stop there. We're seeing the effects of the Global Gag Rule across the health sector, and that's something that we have to pay very close attention to. And the last is, and I think there's been a lot of conversation about that at this conference, we're really seeing a bolstering of an anti-human rights and anti-public health agenda at the country level and at a global level, and that has long-term ramifications. And I think that, when we look across these 3 kind of core areas of impact, we also have to think about the people behind it. I always think about who's the woman in a rural, area who's never heard of the Global Gag Rule, and she certainly doesn't know what's happening in Washington, D.C. What does it mean for her to go one day and find that the clinic she was relying on for birth control, for an HIV test, is not there to serve her anymore? Where can she go? And that was certainly the findings we've seen in our report. We have a quote up here that speaks to that. I'm not going to read it out exactly. The other area that we look at is across the Global Gag Rule's impact. What we know is that it's the communities that already have the least access to care, who already are facing marginalization and barriers, that are most impacted. And that's certainly a finding, I think, that's come out in many of our research on this policy and that we're living day to day, and our panelists will speak to. Young people, the LGBTQ community, indigenous communities, rural populations, and beyond, sex workers that are already facing barriers are now losing either the only provider that was there to them or the one that's trusted. And it's often, as we know, the most qualified expert providers who have the deepest ties to their communities who've been impacted. So, another thread across this policy I want to lift up is that there's a lot of confusion around it. And I think that's a feature, not a glitch. It's by design that it fosters stigma, it silences conversation, and so as a consequence, there's a chilling effect, and people often don't know what the limits are of the policy. And so we're going to talk about what we all can be doing to resist the harms, but one of the things we can do is know exactly what its limitations are and walk right up to the line and not let it take us any further back. So I want to just say, before we turn it to the panel, that we should make no mistake about the intention of what this policy is designed to do. It is an effort to use the tools of diplomacy and foreign aid, which are tools that should be used for promoting peace and security, the health and human rights, and global cooperation, using those tools to suppress and sabotage movements of gender equality. But we won't let them. So I want the main takeaway of this panel to be that everyone here has power to resist the harms of the policy. I think it's designed to often make us feel powerless, and certainly the pathway to reversing it is not an easy one, but in every one of our spheres of day-to-day work and lives, we have the power to fight back, and that's what we're going to discuss today. So with that, I'm going to turn it to our panel. We're going to talk first about what we're seeing, but then we're going to talk about what we can be doing. I'm going to start, Giselle, with you. And I just want each of, we're going to do this as a dialogue, so we'll be in discussion, and soon we'll invite the audience in. In just a couple minutes, what are you seeing as a primary impact in your community and for your organization of the Global Gag Rule?
Thank you so much for inviting us here. And I ran IPPF for Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think to understand the Global Gag Rule in our context, you got to understand a bit of the region. This is a region where donors have left for the most part. It's a region of middle-income countries. And yet the people we serve, the stories we hear are a totally different story, right? Middle-income countries are averages, and the reality that we see on the ground is completely different, with huge pockets of poverty, with one of the most unequal regions in the world. So in this context is where the Global Gag Rule happened. We took a stand. We lost about $5 million for the region, and for some of you might think that's not a lot of money, right? It's not just the number. You mentioned some of the effect very clearly. It's money that is going to be very hard to come by, both because of our own status in relationship to donors' priorities, but also, just in the case, one of the most affected one was the case of Colombia, Pro Familia, our member association in Colombia. They serve about 600,000 women in the country. We had a program paid by the US government to support women who had been demobilized from the internal war as part of the peace process. You know that women in this context are much more prone to violence, have much more difficulties and need care. And we had to, this was a program in about 11 municipalities across the country. We had to scale that back as a result of the loss of funding, right? And that's not money that is going to be replaced. Mm-hmm. And the moment passes as well, right? Women need the care right there, right at that moment. And we need to be able to provide our care. This is a country with, you know, a historic moment. It's the peace moment where you try to work on the reconstruction and really be there supporting that in everything that you can. And it's very upsetting not to be able to do so. The other impact, you know, Colombia received many women migrants from Venezuela. We are one of the main providers of care. Abortion is legal in Colombia in some circumstances. We have been the main provider with our own resources. And for women who come with nothing and need the care, we are there by the border providing the care. And this is another program that has suffered due to the Global Gag Rule imposition. So it's very sad to see the impact immediately on the ground. We didn't need to wait 2 months to see that.
And that example is so striking as well, because we all look at what's happening with migrants across the region, in Venezuela specifically, and know that this is a population that is in need. And these are not issues that sort of are at the front burner of when we think about the Global Gag Rule that are getting impacted. Carol, I want to come to you next, sort of from another organization that's deeply globally impacted. Mike, okay. What are you seeing at Marie Stopes, Uganda?
Thank you. Is it working?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, at Marie Stopes in Uganda, like many other NGOs who refused to sign up to the Global Gag Rule, the immediate effect was loss of funding. And with loss of funding, we had to scale back on some of our services. We did close 5 outreach teams. That means less of the rural underserved had to reach women receiving services when they need them. But for us, more important beyond the loss of funding is the chilling effect. It is quite real. We see isolation with our partners. We see protracted conversations about policy. You know, the discussion about what age girls should be given contraception becomes, you know, protracted unnecessarily. We see multiple changes in access to commodities, and perhaps in the long term, these are supposed to be for a good cause, but the lack of consideration for SRHR, we see that it's taking a backseat in health priorities, and that worries us because this is a framework in which we work. And then what that does is create fear among providers. What that does is create stigma among clients who are receiving services. We also observe a much more bold opposition. We see, attacks, verbal attacks. We have seen staff being arrested. So the environment for service delivery in as far as SRHR is unfriendly and quite tense. So we're doing our best every day to be careful, to do the right thing and not upset anyone. And I think all of this at the backdrop is the Global Gag Rule.
Mm-hmm. So Moses, you're also working in Uganda from an advocacy perspective. Can you build on that experience and share what you're seeing?
Thank you very much. So the first time I got to learn about the Global Gag Rule, we had an advocacy project that was looking at health system strengthening across the board. So it was USAID funded by an international partner. And we had a press conference where we do work on clarification of the legal environment on abortion. So I was summoned to go to the country office to speak about why we are doing work on termination of pregnancy legislation and whether we didn't know that it was not permitted. It had just been announced, but the clarification of what were the parameters for the Global Gag Rule were not yet out. It was very surprising for us that the national office of this international organization was already implementing what was unclear. So just as we were dealing with that, another partner that we had a sub-grant from was not a USAID funded sub-grant. It was a Dutch project. Also sent an addendum to the email that you have to sign to this addendum. So when we read it, it actually was saying that we'll continue to be supported, but we would not be allowed to do work on termination of pregnancy. It was shocking. I wrote a long email explaining that this is not USAID funding. We've just lost USAID funding. And the addendum you're telling us to sign is talking about USAID funding. You know, I think we're a bit myopic then. We later got to learn that this particular partner has USAID funding on other processes that would be affected. Tremendously, as an institution, it affected us because we had just lost a project that was 5 years partnership. Then we certainly lost this. So when you look at the context, it's made things very, very complex because health financing back home is basically out of pocket. So 50%, people spend almost 50% of health services on that. So it means that the government funding, which is 15%, leaves the 35% to donor funding. And the way the funding had been was that USAID was playing a major role. When you talk about family planning services, I think we're darling to USAID aid in the past years. So there was an almost legitimate expectation that the funding gap on family planning would actually be financed by USAID. But this funding is not funding that exclusively comes from USAID to government. It's rather local NGOs that receive either sub-grants or grants to reach out to the communities where people are affected. So the number of cases of people that are actually affected are very many. But working with the league organization, it also got us thinking a lot because it was around the same time that this funding that was coming from USAID was not just for products, but it is funding that is talking about quality of services. It is funding that is talking about policy formulation. And many of the policies that had been formulated were up for revision. So the sexual reproductive health rights, the adolescent health policy, we were working on the termination of pregnancy guidelines. So it was around that time that funding was not coming. But at the same time, we witnessed that the leadership in the Ministry of Health that we had developed a cold feet whenever they read the word rights in a policy. So it was resisted by the ministry, but also we saw that religious-based NGOs were actually reacting much more to any language that was being introduced in the policy. So you may not think about it as global gag rule, but the environment that has been created had created to that. And it raises two things which I'll end with. I think from a legal point of view, you begin to question what the legitimacy of this is in a sovereign state. Because ideally, sovereign states make policies which are supposed to advance the rights of the citizens. Now, once you bring a policy like the Global Gag Rule that affects access to information, that affects access to commodities, and these are life-saving commodities, you're actually affecting the lives of the citizens. As I always tell people, I relate it to the colonial regime because, you know, during colonialism, you would receive these things and you had no choice. You would implement, you know. If you had no choice. We have gone back to the same kind of thinking that a country can't be sovereign over which policies it implements at the national level. And you're basically being held in ransom because of the source of resources. So it raises a serious constitutional issue that I think at the national level we need to think about. But the last thing is that I think this is one government. It's the US. I've been very much looking at what the reaction of the other governments actually is towards this particular policy. What I witness is that people have feelings across the embassies. If it is a love relationship, there is love, that they are opposed to the policy. But we don't see the flowers, you know, to say the love is there. You can't just begin to smile and say this is the love. I think it's a diplomacy issue which we need to see more concerted effort from other agencies to actually engage and oppose. Put the USAID guys to task to do basic things like explain what the Global Gag Rule is at the national level. I've never seen a meeting where USAID has actually called its beneficiaries to come and explain what the Global Gag Rule is. The story could go on and on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think you have a lot of people tweeting, people have feelings right now. Taryn, I'm going to circle back around after this, but Taryn, as a young person in the U.S., how do you see your peers reacting to this policy that's sort of in our name?
Yeah, definitely. So just speaking a little bit from like the youth organizing perspective, especially as a recent college graduate, I found in my experience there was a lot of young people that didn't even know about this rule. They're, certainly associated with the stigma around, just abortion services, abortion policy in general. So I think that's sort of where the power of voices and the power of storytelling comes in, especially, as a theme reoccurring throughout this conference. I know that I, participated in and had the chance to host the 1 in 3 abortion speak out with the advocacy group, Advocates for Youth, just emphasizing the power of stories, getting the sort of recognition of the personal experiences and the people that are actually impacted by abortion. And, I think it's always important to center sort of those folks, center the voices, the people who are being impacted by this, just because, being young and not necessarily having or feeling like you have the tools or the power to affect meaningful policy change can certainly be a deterrent, but making sure that, just being able to express stories, express that your opinion matters, I think holds all the power, and being able to take that first step and getting youth to recognize, what's even going on right now.
Moses and Carol, you both talked about sort of the dynamics between organizations, and I think that's something I want to unpack a little bit. Carol, you talked about sort of feeling isolated and some of the partnerships being strained by this. Moses, I know from what you shared in past conversations, the coalition spaces that you work in have been challenged as well. Can you speak both to that a little bit? What are you seeing as far as the organizations that you work together? How are those relationships changed, and what is the impact that has?
Basic example is, misoprostol is on the essential drugs list, and when we first brought misoprostol into the country, we did it through a pharmacy. So the pharmacy was a local technical representative for the manufacturer. And I remember having a conversation with this pharmacy in 2015 to say, you know what, we have enough capacity inside, you can hand it over and we will handle it. And they said, no, we're happy to continue doing this for you, focus on service delivery. Come 2017, I received an email, so you had wanted to pick up your misoprostol, please come and take it. Reason being that this pharmacy has ambitions to get funding from USAID, so they can no longer work with us. And we've been working together for more than 10 years. So this is what we see every day. When it comes to coalitions, for example, we have the Uganda Family Planning Consortium. On that consortium, we have organizations that are complying with the MCP and others that are not. And that means when we're in the room, we must censor our conversations. And these are, beyond the technical relationships, they are friends. So they'll say, you know what, Carol, you stop there. Stop that conversation there. We can have it in a different room. And yet, ideally, we should be having a comprehensive conversation about the family planning landscape and how we can work together to address the challenges that we face. But we have to censure our conversations in the coalitions. And obviously, that brings you less and less effectiveness in terms of, cohesion. You cannot work together effectively because you have to be careful at each point.
I think it's related experiences. One, there's a lot of secrecy. Each organization will receive an email requiring it to comply. So you don't come into a group like this and say, now you comply. Each one will receive, but whoever receives, whatever action they take is entirely up to them. So you only see the chilling effect in members that were part of a coalition on advocacy issues when they either stop coming, or when they come, they participate, but they are shy if there are any pictures taken, or if there are any press conferences, they don't want to participate. So that has affected relationships that we actually do have with the different members. But also, I think organizations internally have been surviving on USAID for a long time. People's contracts are on the front line. It's jobs, it's lives. So sometimes, no matter how much you want to raise awareness, I think it becomes difficult for people to open up on what's happening. So coalition building is extremely complex. Secrecy is the order of the day. It makes things very, very difficult. Now, in advocacy where you are mixed with service providers, we've had situations where the service providers begin to stigmatize advocacy groups because you are causing them trouble. They have targets they have set. If they keep quiet and they operate quietly without anyone knowing what's happening, they achieve the objectives. Now you come with your advocacy and you're making noise and you're on the radio station, you're causing them trouble. So having cohesion within alliances, within coalitions, between service provider institutions and advocacy coalitions has been extremely difficult. And I think we've had, in some cases, to have a very concrete conversation to say, let's respect each other's space to be able to do things. But at the same time, we need to be mindful that, you know, people's lives, people's contracts are on the line. Yeah.
Giselle, well, this is what I'm thinking about is I know Latin America has, this is not the first time Latin America has dealt with the Global Gag Rule. And in fact, probably it's with USAID's and the U.S. global health funding has diminished in the region in general. You all sort of are in a position to see 10, 15 years out, what was the legacy? So what are you seeing as still remnants of the last time the policy was in place?
It's interesting because many years after the policies have changed, under the Obama time, I remember I began doing abortion work, doing some research in some of the countries who had been subject to the prior global gag rules, and I was hearing both of you because it's very much in the same line. Many years after, providers are still feel self-censored. Organizations, because there is a legacy, there is an inertia there, right? When you have gone through these processes, you talk about the chilling effect, and I think of it in Spanish, and I think it's the freezing effect. People freeze, and that has a long-lasting effect in healthcare providing institutions. But I also wanted to add to some of your thoughts. You know, it's a very unfair rule. It's anti-democratic, and I think it doesn't work. If the purpose of the rule is to stop women from having abortion, we have plenty of evidence. I was just reading the latest book from Jana Rogers. She's a Dutch feminist economist out of Rutgers University. She's looking at the prior rules and assessing the impact on abortion seeking behavior for women. It's much worse after the rule, much worse. Particularly, we have some data for Latin America and the Caribbean. So it's very hard to deal with also because it's unfair, it's anti-democratic, it doesn't pursue any benefit and hurts women and hurts organizations. I think you both we talk about the notion of shrinking of the civil society space. It's a very cool term to define exactly this. You're ostracized from spaces. You are holding yourself from having conversations that are important, right? So I think that has a long-lasting effect. That doesn't end when the rule ends. To begin with, because many of the people who are at the missions who are there and will continue to be there, and much of it relates to their own interpretation of the rule, and that's not homogeneous. Let's put it that way, right?
We have an example we found in our report of an organization in Latin America, to your point, who was told that they were not eligible for a peace and security grant because they did family planning. wrong on all levels, just to clarify, in case anyone's not sure. The policy doesn't apply to peace and security funds, and family planning is absolutely allowable services, but it speaks to the fear. And so when I say that we all have power, one of the things is we can walk right up to the line of what is allowed, and because that gulf of what where we're fearful of and where we're stepping back to and what's allowed is often the difference between people's lives. So as both a follow-up and to pivot to sort of our next phase, which is what can we all do? Taryn, I want to kick off with you. Again, we do feel, I think, often powerless by this policy, but I know certainly as an American, I feel a lot of responsibility for holding my government to account. Can you speak to what young people are doing and how energized they are in response to this policy?
Sure.
And these issues?
Yeah, and once again, just building back on making space and the power of storytelling. I think that that's essential. That's, I feel, at the heart of the movement, and especially speaking as an American youth, kind of feeling blindsided and a little bit powerless by, what we can do to affect, like I said, meaningful change. My recommendation and the thing that I try to keep central in my advocacy is making space for others to step up, making space for those stories, which is why I feel like storytelling was one of the big essential pieces, especially in the abortion speak out. So I always feel like, youth are the movement, especially of today. And I think that's where we need to keep our advocacy centered in the power of stories.
And I think actually what you're saying spoke to me very much in the context of the stigma we're hearing about, that sort of our stories are an incredibly rebellious act. Carol, what can sort of providers do at the country level who are facing this policy to resist its harm?
From the perspective of Marie Stopes as a service provider organization, as I said, we're affected at two levels. One is loss of funding, and two is the chilling effect. And we need to find ways to address both of these. In terms of loss of funding, we're changing. We are rethinking how we program. We're doing our best to wean ourselves off donor funding, especially for provision of self-abortion services. We're thinking efficiency, we're thinking income generation, we're thinking sustainability. And we're doing this in all sorts of ways. Even when we have donor income, we do our best to stretch it furthest. But overall, we want to make sure that, when we have donor funding, our scale is maximum. But when we don't have it, we remain in business. Even if our scale is curtailed, at least we're there, and women can stretch and find us. In terms of the chilling effect, it's a two-edged sword, really. On the one hand, they're chilling and everyone is sad and feeling down. But on the other hand, I think we are lucky that through this period, we are identifying who's really committed to the movement, who's really committed to delivering services for women. We are building a strong force of providers. People who work in this season are really committed to the women that they serve. So we're doing our best to do values clarification, work with the likes of Moses to make sure everyone understands what the law does, so that we move up to the maximum, extent that the law can allow us, and giving them the support that they need, values clarification, provider share workshops, in order to help to manage the stress. But overall, I think that at the end of this period, I don't know how long it's going to last, we will have a very strong group of providers who are here and committed to the cause of delivering for women.
And Moses, from the perspective of an advocate at the country level, what can be done?
I think it makes a lot of sense to frame this from the perspective of the person that is affected. It is the usual woman, the usual young girl that would want the service. Now, this same person in the past has been, discriminated, has received violence. It's been the family, it's been the clan. But now, the person that is violating is much higher. It's global violation of the rights. Now, the interventions we've been doing before that are very local centered I think we need to think of the way in which we frame them, to understand that it is not just a health issue, it's a power issue that has to be handled, and therefore, whatever interventions we think about, in addition to what everyone has said, we must have interventions that tackle power, power between states, power within the state itself, remind the state of its obligations, use, democratic arguments, constitutional arguments over this. I don't think that we've done enough of that. We need to tackle the power and make sure that, where the power imbalance is and where the unfairness is actually tackled. Yeah.
Giselle?
I was thinking, like Carol, and I think Latin America and the Caribbean has a lot of experience in, because we didn't have any other option but to work towards being financially independent. And I think that's very important, particularly for healthcare providing institutions. You might have to cut programs, scale back, but closing clinics is a whole different ballgame. And I think we have had, because of the number of global gag rules we experience already, and the pull out of the donors, a lot of experience in how to become financially sustainable. We are not there yet, but it's clearly where one needs to go. I'm also, I'm from Argentina, so I just think. We won't back down, right? We take the streets, we continue fighting for abortion law reform, we will continue to do so. So if I have recommendations, I think if you're a donor, this is the moment to be funding all of it, the margins of it, the most innovative ideas. It's the moment to be funding outside of your geographies. Yes, this is the moment. In the case of Argentina, we benefit greatly from the experience of Ireland, for instance, both regions, countries that are not donors' priorities in any way. Processes feed each other in ways that are very interesting. It's like throwing a stone in a lake. The movement is way bigger than you ever predicted. And I think that's where we have to go to fight these, to really go and make the changes that are needed. There, we have to overcome this division between advocates and healthcare providers. Healthcare providers have proved to be a very important voice in abortion law reform efforts everywhere, right? How do we do that is what we should be discussing, but certainly bringing the voices of those who have day-to-day experience with women, in addition to the voices of women, to the forefront seems to be the key there. And I think for everyone, this is the moment to engage, right? I always think, I am giving money as an individual to everything I believe in. If I had very important government donors in front of me, I would tell them, give money to young people. They're living every fight worth fighting from gun reform to abortion law reform to climate justice. I think I have a lot of hope in our ability to fight this by being at the forefront and fighting the good fights, and we will not back down, so not now and not ever, right?
I like the image of the ripple effect, because I think sometimes we talk about the ripple effect negatively with the gag rule, and I like thinking about it positively in a policy that's inherently designed to suppress advocacy, to suppress our voices. The most powerful way we can resist is to speak up. To echo, Taryn, what you said. I want to open up questions. I have lots of questions, but I want to open it up and not be the only one. So we have mics up here at the front, I believe. Yes, we have a question right here in the front.
Hi, thank you, everyone, for this. You were mentioning about the vagaries of the language and how that's intentional. And I think that's right. And I think we've experienced in the last couple of weeks further detail that seems to imply further expansion. And so I think to your point about kind of doing everything we can to walk right up to the line, I think it would be really helpful particularly for the organizations that are having trouble unpacking that language, clarifying it, knowing what the line is, to support either you all and your organizations or getting a coalition together to help clarify what that line looks like very, very specifically. And I think that will do a lot for those organizations who are complying with the rule, to know very clearly, both at a global level and on the ground, how far they can go, and to have that be sort of endorsed across all organizations.
Well, and actually, I'm just to take moderator's prerogative here for a moment. If folks, and I know many people in this room are working on providing technical assistance on what the policy does and does not say, can you raise your hand if you're one of those organizations? There's some here. I know it's a dark room. Okay, I see about 6 hands. If you're an organization working to provide technical assistance on what the Global Gag Rule does and doesn't do. Okay, so we've got a bunch of folks, and I would just say this is not going to be the solution, and for folks tuning in online, I apologize, but a number of folks, I think, in our field are there, and I would say one action and power we each have is, if you're confused, ask. And don't just ask someone who's working at a USAID local office. Total respect, but that's not necessarily the only source of information, and it's worth verifying, because we do have evidence that sometimes it's not, there's still confusion there. So thank you for that comment. I don't know if anyone else had a response to that. Okay, other questions? Yep, right here. Can we?
Thank you very much. I live in the United States, and I would love your advice as to what we should be doing now. I very much appreciate the youth movement. I'd love to hear from you as to what steps we should be taking, because for some of us, this is kind of new. It's a new fight for some of us, so I'd love your advice.
Taryn?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I definitely think, as much as possible, from the opportunities that I had with my fellowship with Planned Parenthood, as well as a little bit with Advocates for Youth, there were lobbying activities that, I did get the chance to participate in. So, those are definitely great, as much as possible. Also, speaking as a recent college graduate, trying to educate my campus community a little bit at UCLA on the Global Gag Rule. I did host a little bit of a session. So I think just the minuscule things, hosting workshops, hosting sessions, just educating in the first place, I feel like was a very incremental step, where, like I said, a lot of young people, especially on my campus, didn't even know about this rule. How can I help? What can I do? What can I get involved in? Of course, Planned Parenthood and, the report, among multiple other resources, were a really great piece of information that I'm always willing to give out, reading a little bit of a snippet. I know Cecile Richards did an awesome little snippet on YouTube that's really short about the Global Gag Rule that I always point folks towards too. So, I wish there was a simple answer. I wish I had all the money and all the funding, to be able to give, and support. But yeah.
Well, I think, but to build off that as well, I think a lot of Americans don't know how, when we talk about global policy, they think it's happening at the UN, and some of it is, but a lot's happening in the halls of Congress, and it's legislators that U.S. Voters are electing, and they deserve to know what your values are and what you care about, and that's something, I think we can all do. Just to say, there is legislation called the Global HER Act that would be a permanent repeal to the Global Gag Rule, and has had historic levels of initial support. So I think there is a long-term, and I always want to say when I'm in a global space that there's a very fierce coalition fighting on this every day. So don't think that anyone's sitting down on this one in the U.S. Yeah. Other questions? I'm going to take in the middle here. Doing a time check. Yeah, there's someone in the back next. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. So I'm Erin, currently a proud Canadian, but it has not always been thus. And I wanted to ask about the ripple effects of the Global Gag Rule extending beyond American foreign policy. So we know previously in Canada, under our former Conservative government, there were not as severe provisions, but similar provisions taken, I'm assuming, really modeled on the American example to to repeal development assistance going towards abortion. So I'm curious about whether there's any mapping or research being done about the threat of similar kinds of policies going through in other countries, particularly as we see this rise of right-wing coalition governments in Europe, for example. And if that does seem to be a trend, of what can we do about it?
Well, and I can just say I know that we've seen a similar policy proposed in the EU as well, though thankfully not successful. Do you all want to, any thoughts on this? Actually, Moses, not to put you on the spot here, but I do think you spoke a little bit to national policy trends that seem to maybe not be directly tied to the gag rule, but are inspired by anything in that respect you want to speak to?
No, I think it's to do with the retrogression overall, which you may not necessarily tag to the global gag rule, but I think to the fundamentalist and fundamentalism of groups, probably some evangelical groups that are very strong. And some of this is historical because in the context of Uganda, I think religious groups still provide about 30 or 35% of health care, and people access health care in their facilities. So these facilities are not as progressive as I ought to be seeing. But at the same time now, because they are like NGOs, they are the biggest beneficiaries of the available funding. And therefore they are invited into also policy making spaces. They have so much power that in spaces like in Uganda, in the ministry, you'll find that up to the top leadership, these people are evangelicals. So they would be listening to elders from the churches that they go to. So they do not only just influence the service delivery in their facilities, but also influence the policy-making processes overall. I think it's a general trend that is coming with the change of leadership and popularism that we are seeing world over. Yeah.
I think there's a question in the back, all the way, and we can probably do 2 to 3 more questions. Why don't we we'll take 3 at once so we can try and get through them.
Hi, everyone. Jennifer Brenner, AJWS. Excellent presentation. Of course, moderation, Chloe, as always. Just one quick comment and then a question. So on the issue around funding and how do we mitigate the harms, obviously the Global HER Act was just mentioned. There's a lot of work to try to stop over-implementation and going up into the line. And then there's the question of what other governments, multilaterals, and funders can and should be doing during this time. And there are a number of private and public funders that are coming together to look at how to create alternatives. Obviously, governments have made some announcements, but there are some really concrete things that funders should be doing right now. And so if there are funders in the room, there are some of us that are coming together regularly to talk about this, to bring funder affinity groups to talk about this, and to think about how do we treat the global gag rule as one manifestation of many on this rising extremism, fundamentalism, and anti-gender, anti-rights agenda, but because it's coming from the United States as well, how this is sort of reverberating across the world in terms of emboldening transphobic, homophobic, anti-gender activists, as well as policymakers. So if that is of interest to you, please do come and see me. But also, I'm curious from your perspective, what are some of the things that funders can and should be doing to support your work or to help create a more enabling environment?
Great, and I'm going to take 2 more. So I've got 1 up here in the front, 2 in the front. And thank you to our mic runner. Everyone has power right here, right here. Oh. Yeah, you can do her first. Okay. Yep, there we go.
Hi, I'm from the Safe Abortion Action Fund, hosted by IPPF, so we do fund abortion.
Thank you.
Very much so. I'm sort of thinking about this from a kind of philosophical perspective. I hope that's okay. I'm thinking about the root underneath this, which is the abortion stigma and this kind of categorization of abortion as something different to everything else, right? Contraception's good, abortion's bad. And, USAID is not the only donor to draw that strong line. And so I'm kind of thinking, what is it that we can do in our sector and in other sectors to also work on that underlying stigma and I suppose learn from the reproductive justice movement. So I just wanted to know if people had ideas about challenging this stigma of abortion as something very different to all the other work that we're doing when we know it isn't the case.
All right, and then last question right here in the front.
Hi, my name is Donia, and my question is for Giselle. And I guess you mentioned something about funding being much less in the Latin American Caribbean region, and that was really surprising to me because I don't see the need as much less. In fact, I see it like greater today than ever from my visits in the region. And I'm just wondering like if that is kind of indicates the tokenization of donors like from region to region. So one region for a decade is like really popular and then they move on to another region. And really the power that donors have in the lives of like women in marginalized communities. And so, you know, if you could speak a little bit about that.
Let's do one more question, and someone very eager in the back. I think it's Shannon. And just to recap the questions we have so far, we've got what can donors do? We go, how do we tackle abortion stigma? I'm sure we can knock that one out in 30 seconds. And then sort of tokenization, sort of shifting donor norms around geographic focus. And then Shannon, last question, please.
So thank you so much for this panel. It's been really interesting and really interesting to see how the findings that you are all experiencing are things that we found in our report, which was just released yesterday. But my question actually is for Moses, because you mentioned how you lost your USAID funding and then you lost your Dutch funding because the prime recipient of that was enforcing the gag rule on all partners. I was just wondering when that happened, for starters, but also whether you have seen similar impacts from other donor funds or others in Uganda have seen similar impacts of that policy.
Great. So I think let's just go down the line on these questions. Giselle, if you want to start, and then we'll and also take it with sort of final. Let me just do a time check here. Yeah, final comments as well.
No, excellent questions. It's hard to give advice to donors, let me tell you. But I think what I was saying earlier, this is the time to double down on investments. This is a time to either win big or lose big, so there is no doubt. If you have money, this is time to put it towards the causes you care about. You donors and you as individuals, right? This is a time to engage fully, to show up, to be in march, to use our collective intelligence. It's also the time to fund outside of your normal scope, outside of your geographies. I think Donia's question about why Latin America and the Caribbean, we have averages that indicate that we are more developed countries. Averages hide huge inequalities. When we look at the women we serve, their stories don't match any of those numbers. We gotta be able to look deeper and fund organizations in the ground doing that work. Fund at the intersection of things. I very much like your thought, because gender is what is under attack. And that means probably from the donor's perspective that you gotta fund the different parts of this movement, right? Both together, the LGBTQ sexually diverse organizations along with the Reproductive Rights organizations to come together and build a unified front. When you look at the experience in Latin America and the Caribbean, we had gender identity laws and marriage equality laws passed way before some of the abortion laws. We gotta come together and build a unified front, and I think money is not the solution but helps definitely. I just think when I look at the experience of our region in comprehensive sexuality education and everything that they call the gender ideology, right? Gender and gender equality is at the core of this fight. It isn't just about abortion. It's about the whole continuum of the progressive agenda. So if they are attacking our core issues, we gotta come together, forming a unified front to fight back. That would be my recommendation, if I can.
I think very related to that, what should donors be thinking about? I think in history, movements that have been built around life-threatening things have succeeded. In Uganda, we didn't think that we'll roll back on the LGBTI fights. But where life has been threatened, if we begin to frame the issues at hand as life-threatening, and we begin to support groups to work as movements, not necessarily as service providers or advocacy or whatever, find a way in which space is created to have movements that are fighting this life-threatening aspect, I think it would be important. But also to think about beyond money. When I look at other governments, I think it's a diplomacy issue. Probably diplomats are doing their work, which we are not seeing, but I think some more diplomacy work has to happen. Engage this, if the government of Uganda engaged this on a diplomatic front, it would make a lot of meaning, but also where donors are meeting in the countries which have been affected. I think having those donor diplomacy discussions on some of these. I've been in meetings where the health development partners meet in Uganda, and this way I've drawn this. They are all concerned. Then someone from the US Embassy is there feeling concerned, but they don't give any response when this issue has come up for discussions. So our funding was lost around the same time when the policy had just been passed, had just been talked about. It was a very difficult moment. And one of the things that it made us realize is that I think the funding system has to change. We come from a perspective of, project-based funding, where I have this deliverable to give and everything is tagged to an activity. So when you lose funding and you don't have core funding, and that time we had no core funding at all. So it made us realize that as organizations that are engaged in the space, we need to get into the space where we engage with our funding partners to think about core funding, which gives you room to move around. It's very complicated losing staff because you've lost project-based funding. So the donors also need to think about the models of funding, because this work that we engage in is just like the way you would talk about human rights protectors on the front line. I think we need to perceive it from that perspective. Thank you.
Thanks.
And just to touch on how we tackle abortion stigma, again, this is one topic that we could spend the whole night here. But high level, what I think works is knowledge. We need to be serious about the knowledge revolution at two levels. One, knowledge to women and girls. Women and girls need to know what is legal, what is illegal, what is safe, what is unsafe, the repercussions of unsafe, and where they can find safe. And because I see that a lot of the stigma is built in misinterpretation of the law and making girls believe that if they're found in a situation where they need an abortion service, they have done something illegal. No one wants to be associated with illegal. So we must give them knowledge. And unfortunately, we're kind of gagged also at the end of comprehensive sex education, because that's another strategic blockage there. But we need to start early, as earliest as we can access girls. And this is not to tell them, go and have an abortion, no. It's to tell them everything that they need to know about their sexuality, so that when they have to make decisions, they're from an informed point. The other side of the knowledge revolution is to service providers also, because they are scared, they are afraid, they don't understand what the law allows, they are intimidated, they are paying bribes to law enforcement officials, and they are being harassed. Again, if we do clarify to them what the law allows, what is not allowed, what they're entitled to, who they can talk to, then they will have the confidence to continue providing services. The other thing that I think we can touch in terms of handling stigma is maintaining service delivery. Mm-hmm. We do not know how long the Global Gag Rule is going to be here, but if we chicken out in the middle of the period, then starting will be very difficult. And it will actually make sense that, whatever is happening is wrong. So we must, at all costs, maintain service delivery. And this does help to manage stigma.
Taryn?
Well, just piggybacking off of what Doctor said, I think really just on my end here in terms of addressing the question about abortion stigma, since that was a little bit of my most recent background with the 1 in 3 campaign, is centralizing and making every effort to break down the stigma around language as much as possible. Like, I'm always the person to say, you know, abortion stigma, that, you know, was one of the critical things in the 1 in 3 movement, is that, you know, no one wants to say abortion. You know, even going back to, you know, comprehensive sexual education roots, you know, folks not wanting to use proper names, folks not wanting to say penis, folks not wanting to say vagina, like, you know, so breaking down the stigma around words, because that's important. That's important, getting the steps to breaking down, you know, the stigma around abortion, the stigma around, you know, access to comprehensive sexual health education, the stigma around care. So I think, you know, calling a spade, being able to, you know, speak about those things confidently so others know, younger generations, peers, folks that are older than you know, that it's okay to talk about these things, that, you know, it's not normal or marginalized. I'm sorry, that it's not unnormal or marginalized, that, you know, we can speak about these things. You know, we can break down the stigma around, you know, the laws around these laws. I think that's always one of the most important first steps.
So just before we wrap up, I just want to summarize some of the actions we all can take, because I think, again, I think this policy feeds on a sense of powerlessness. And so the number one way we can resist is to feel powerful, and to take steps and to resist the complacency. We can advocate national governments. We can fund movements. If you're a provider, you can know your rights. Continue to provide services where you can. If you're a young person, you can speak up. If you're an American, you can express your values to decision makers. You can, if you're an advocate, you can talk to advocates in your sector, in other sectors, and bring them into the conversation. Make sure they know they're part of this conversation. What am I missing? You can tweet about this constantly. You can march. What protest are you going to this weekend? And you can resist the stigma yourself in terms of segregating these issues. I think that we have to keep bringing it up and not let the chilling effect take us hold and restrict our conversations. So thank you for all being part of this conversation at the very end of Women Deliver. I hope we're walking out feeling more energized to tackle this issue going forward. Thanks. Thank you. The sticker. It was from Ipas. I know. I need to get it. Hi, Chloe. Nice to meet you. I'm like putting off my mic. I've got a mental meeting. There's one. I was actually hoping to get a second. One thing, well, two. One, I think was made during. And it's like, don't, figure out how to, if you can, figure out how to do it. It's hard.